All right, we'll go ahead and get started here. Thanks everyone for joining us today for our webinar on Infor Lawson system planning and essential updates to consider really this year and potentially in the next year. My name is Rob Flannery. I'll be your presenter today. I oversee our technical services group here at Intellias. And I've been helping a lot of our customers navigate this and work through some of the updates that are coming down the pipeline. First, just want to talk a little bit about Intellias. We are an Infor Alliance partner. We have both professional services around all aspects of the Infor system, functional consulting, technical consulting, upgrade support, et cetera. And we also have a set of proprietary software products that complement or sit along the Lawson system. And we've been in this space for quite some time now. We started in 1999. And have a headquarters in Dallas, Texas, and also offices in Chicago. Our agenda today will be pretty simple. The point of this kind of meeting today, I guess, is to get the information out there, talk a little bit about what's new, give you some key takeaway items for your organization, and then open it up to any questions that come up. You can either unmute yourself or send something in the chat. We'll be monitoring that as well. Some of the key updates we want to talk about aren't necessarily new today. Some of this has been out for quite some time, but I think they're items that customers have been aware of or slightly aware of, but I think are really going to be important to focus on the next year or so. The biggest update is going to impact the Windows customers, support for Windows Server 2019. Most customers who are running Windows today on-premise or on a 2012 R2 environment. That operating system is coming up on end of life from Microsoft, and so Infor has certified their solution for the newer version of the operating system. We'll talk a little bit about what that means. One of the key updates that I've seen recently is that if you've looked at this in the past, pretty much everything across the board was certified for 2019 except for Landmark. Landmark, a while ago, was only certified for Server 2016. Recently, the compatibility matrix has changed, and so now I think it's kind of a nice thing. You can certify and deploy Server 2019 solutions across the board for all your Infor apps. On the database side of things, most Windows customers are using SQL Server. There are some with Oracle. But both of the more modern, newer relational database management systems in SQL Server 2019 and Oracle 19c are also supported. So these are major upgrades that really have nothing to do with the Infor product itself, but obviously are core to its function at the OS and database level that are going to need to be addressed in the very near future. A couple other things that are third-party products that do run and support the environment would be the Java platform, Java Development Kit. Most customers are running, if you're on Windows, a version of Oracle Java. What's recently changed with Oracle is they've decided to license for it with Java 8. So if you're still running on Java 7, we'll talk about that in a second. Java 8 is the highest version you can go to and really the minimum required version for most of the newer environment components that Infor has put out. You have two options there, Oracle or Amazon Corretto. I think the big distinction there is that Oracle is now charging a license fee for Java 8. So that's something you need to get directly from Oracle. Infor does not provide it and otherwise has another cost that's not really anticipated when you're supporting your system. So Corretto is an open source alternative, so it's free. And so that becomes an option with some of these newer operating system versions to look at. So that's something we're encouraging customers to evaluate now, and as part of these updates is, do you want to make a switch from Oracle to Amazon so that you do not have to deal with the additional licensing requirements from Oracle. You have to work directly with the Oracle sales rep for that or your account manager. Typically, the Java licensing is done per core. So that can get a little bit costly if you're virtualizing your servers, where you can't just license, specific VMs. You're licensing at the core, at the host level, and so it can get out of hand quickly. And so the Corretto alternative becomes more and more attractive for that reason. And also updated ADFS support. So Infor mandated customers move to ADFS a number of years ago. At the time, the highest version that was supported was ADFS 3, which it runs on, which is directly tied to the Windows operating system release level. So ADFS 3 is delivered with Server 2012 R2. They've had newer versions of ADFS supported for some time, but I think it's important to call out, even back then, I personally was getting a lot of pushback from some of the infrastructure teams at customers saying, well, we don't want to deploy a new server on 2012 R2. And at the time, that was it. ADFS 3 was the highest version. Now, with all of these other updates, you can go all the way up to ADFS 5 or ADFS 2019, which is deployed with the newer version of Windows Server. So still have to use ADFS. There's really no way getting around that, but you can modernize ADFS and upgrade it. Obviously, from a Microsoft standpoint, that's a good thing. But also, if you're using Azure, there's other benefits with that, where there's tighter integrations with Azure. So with ADFS 4 and higher, you can natively integrate Azure MFA and things like that into your environment if you're so inclined to do that. So at a high level, here's the key takeaways from this, but really each customer deployment is unique. I think it's important to take each of these items and look at your current environment, current landscape, architecture, and deployment, and dig deep through the compatibility matrix, because there's going to be things that you find that say, well, great, we want to go to Amazon Corretto. Well, you really have to be at this environment release level, which requires this operating system level or this database level or so on and so forth. And there's all these kind of dependencies. So what we find out ends up happening most of the time is there's this cascading kind of snowball effect where to handle all of these things, you can't really do them one at a time. It's something that you're going to have to do in one big bang approach to look at all of these updates. For the sake of this presentation, I'll also call out that we're really focused on the core products, so LSF, Landmark, Ming.le, that most on-premise Lawson customers do have deployed. If you have other kind of bolt-on products like strategic sourcing contract management, MSCM, the mobile supply chain management, LBI, Smart Office, all of those other things are impacted as well. We're not going to necessarily cover them on here, but that is something, again, you can find in the compatibility matrix and make sure that your plan and strategy lines up with the rest of your overall solution. So what does this mean from a timing perspective? Just throw out some key dates here. Again, all of this is vendor-driven, not necessarily Infor, other vendors, third-party vendors that the Infor solution depends on. So the key players here will be Microsoft and Oracle. And I think the biggest one, if you're a Windows customer and you're on-premise, this Windows Server 2012 R2 end of life is a big one. The end of support is in October 2023. And basically at that point, what that means is you'll no longer be receiving updates and patches to the operating system unless you pay Microsoft extended support or something else like that. So you need to move off that environment, upgrade the operating system. Along with that, and when you're doing that, if you're still using Ming.le Foundation version 11, that's based on SharePoint 2013, that also has upcoming end of life, and then the various SQL Server components as well. So if you're still on SQL 2012, that end of life is coming very soon. You may look at upgrading to 2014, but then that still has not a very long window left to support. And so, that's where these things start to stack of, okay, what's our major threshold, our point to look at, and then addressing all of these things together, likely with an operating system upgrade for your environment. If you're on the Oracle database platform, the same thing. All of our customers are trying to get up to 19C. So if you're below that on the 12C release or 18C release, there's some dates here that some of them have already passed or upcoming. You should be looking to get to the 19C release. And with that, that doesn't mean you can just go to your DBA and say, please upgrade my Oracle system. You really need to go through the compatibility matrix, because what will happen is Infor will say, well, Oracle 19c is only certified if you're on LSF, I'm just making numbers up, but you're on LSF 10.11 CU2 or something like that. Well, if you're below that, you're still on LSF 10.09, there's a potential that things would break if you just upgraded the database. So as you look at upgrading these other components that you may not directly manage as an Infor system administrator, you need to look at the compatibility matrix and see where these dependencies are, because there's likely a Java update, an LSF update, maybe an IBM WebSphere update, that all have to be done and coincide with the ultimate goal of upgrading the database or upgrading the operating system. So there's lots of different dependencies to look at. So this is on the kind of infrastructure side of things. On the software side of things, a lot of these have come and gone. There's a lot of you on the call that have probably already addressed this, but I've decided to leave it on the slide because I still do have a lot of customers that haven't addressed these things yet. So if you fall into that category, pretty much all the items on this list are things that should have already been done, and if they're not, they need to be a top priority because it's just going to make future updates harder and harder and harder. So the LS's STS replacement with ADFS project, so moving to ADFS for authentication was something that was mandated back in 2019. IE11, not a lot of customers using that, but you may have IE11, out there for other types of products, and you have some customers maybe with like ImageNow or something like that, they're still using Internet Explorer 11. That product is completely out of support from Infor as of October 2020. I think I saw a recent update on the landmark side of things that it will be completely unoperational in the coming months. So not just not supported, if something breaks, you can't open a ticket, it just will not work. So if you still have end users on IE11, getting rid of that and moving to a Chrome or Edge-based or a Chromium-based Edge browser is really the direction you should be taking. And again, with that, support for the latest version of Chrome requires you generally to be on the highest version of, or the latest version of LSF and the portal and so on and so forth. And that's where these things really do start to snowball and mesh together. Ming.le and Silverlight, those two kind of go together as well. In October of last year, Microsoft stopped supporting the Silverlight product, which was a key component of the Ming.le Foundation or the SharePoint-based Ming.le environment. And so what that means is basically that entire product now is in sustained maintenance or out of support. And so customers are moving and upgrading to Ming.le 12, or that's really not the name of it. It's called Infor OS, the more modern, newer version and replacement of Ming.le. It's an entire technology stack, removes the SharePoint dependency, all of those types of things. And so that's a product that I know a lot of customers are still using, which is now out of support explicitly. And the upgrade path for that would be to move to Infor OS, which would replace your Ming.le Foundation SharePoint solution. The LDAP channel binding is another one that was a really hot topic a couple of years ago, but basically that would be the connection to your, if you're using ADLDS for your LDAP repository for Lawson, or you have a bind going to Active Directory for authentication. That's talking about that connection that's being made. Microsoft a couple of years ago had said, we're going to force you to make those connections secure. So kind of like HTTP versus HTTPS, encrypted and non-encrypted web traffic. The same thing is true on the LDAP connection, LDAP versus LDAP-S. Microsoft was going to force customers to use secure connections, and they kind of backtracked a little bit. So we're not going to force it, but we really recommend it, and here's how you can enforce it in your own environment. And so that's something to talk with your network security infrastructure teams at your own organization about and understand, is this something you're going to plan to enforce? And if so, then there is action that's going to be required on the Infor side of things to convert those connections into LDAP-S or secure connections. So the time frame on that, I think the sooner the better. The reality is, that's something you can implement now and then wait for your infrastructure engineers or server engineers, whoever managing your domain controllers. Then when they turn that feature on, you're already compliant. So it's a good thing to just get out in front of. And then Java 7, that end of support is coming. If you still have Java 7 in your Infor environment, that's something you're going to need to move away from. All of the newer versions of the environment require Java 8 for the most part. So you're going to be forced to upgrade that when you upgrade your environment, but that's something else that's running out of support. So a lot of information here, and I think every customer is going to be different. Everyone has a little bit of a unique deployment. I think it's important to really gather all the facts, understand where your current landscape is at. So what Infor versions are you on? What operating systems are you running? How many servers do you have? How do they connect with one another? What's your database platform? And then come up with a goal. What's your roadmap? And I think understanding what the product life cycle is key to that. So Microsoft and Oracle have their own life cycle policies, and Infor also has one. So you need to balance those two, or take both of them, all of them, into account as you develop your plan and strategy going forward. I think it's important to start planning that roadmap now. I mean, the date for Microsoft dropping support for Server 2012 R2 is quite a ways out on the calendar, but the reality is that project and initiative is pretty large. It's going to have a big impact on the business users. It's going to require a lot of testing. We have things like open enrollment. We have things like year end, where we're not going to be able to change the system, or we're not going to be able to have access to our end users for testing. So all of a sudden, understanding that this is a pretty involved project, and then we're going to have time constraints around business as usual activities, which limit when we can do work, when we can deploy changes, et cetera. It's really not that far out of a timeline. And it's one of those things you don't want to get, kind of behind the eight ball, where you want to be, you don't want to be chasing it. So, now it's 2023, it's February, a year from now, and we've got to move by October, and you're kind of forced into it by Microsoft's timeline. It's better to be on your own time, be ahead of it, and be ready before that date comes. I would say another thing that's key is, a lot of customers are evaluating what's next. Infor came out and said, we're committing to support the Lawson product on premise through April 2026. A lot of customers looked at that and said, great, I'm going to ride it out. Others have said, well, it's time to start looking. Are we going to upgrade to CloudSuite or version 11? We're not sure yet. We're evaluating it, or we've committed to it and we're starting our project. Everyone's going to be in a different position. But I think it's important to understand that at this point in time, we're almost getting to the point where action is going to be required no matter what. If you're moving to version 11 or CloudSuite, that's potentially going to be a 8 to 24 month engagement. If you're moving to another ERP platform altogether, probably even longer. And so if you're not going to be live on that system, stabilized and completely removed from Lawson before October 2023, you're still going to need to be looking at upgrading, even if you're getting rid of your Lawson system. If you can't get rid of it before that deadline, you're either going to need to pay Microsoft for extended support, or you're going to need to go through an upgrade to get on a supported version of the operating system. So thinking about when you're getting off of Lawson, if you're going to get off of Lawson, and understanding where that falls on your timeline. And once you're off of Lawson, how much longer do you still need Lawson to run for some reason? Maybe you're phasing out implementation of finance and HR, or HR and payroll. So you get part of the application upgraded or moved, but you're still running something else in-house. Even if it's for 5 users in your finance department, doesn't matter. The operating system is still coming to end of life. So it's very important to think about not just today and your current ERP, but what's coming in the future. Where does that land on our timeline, and how does that play into these dates that are coming down from Microsoft, Oracle, Infor, et cetera, for support for their own products you're running today? Someone had asked for me to repeat when the support for on-prem will end. If you look on the support site, Infor released a critical notification, or a statement of direction of support. I forget what they called it, but they're basically committing to support the on-premise Lawson system through April 2026 at this point. So that's the date they've publicized. And again, if you've already decided to upgrade or move away from Lawson, really think about how that project's phased. Because if you're going to have any part of Lawson continuing to run after those dates, you're going to need to still do something to remain in support. Again, either paying for extended support from Microsoft or going ahead and upgrading the servers. For the Lawson product lifecycle, generally you're not going to see explicit dates out there. For the product solution as a whole, we can tell you April 2026. But for specific versions of the environment, what's the product lifecycle? I always like to this is published. You can go find it on the knowledge base. I put the link here, 194, or the number 1947090. You can go get the whole document. There's a lot of information out there, but basically, it's an N-2. So you never want to be more than 2 releases behind the most current release, because that release is no longer going to receive fixes. So what that would mean is LSF 10.0.11 is the latest release that's out there. Customers on LSF 10.09 and 10.0.10 are continuing to receive updates. But if and when they release LSF 10.0.12, well, now if you're on LSF 10.09, you're out of support. So as fixes and updates come, you're no longer going to be able to receive them. The patch bundles are only going to be for N-2. So in addition to all of the other third-party products, operating system, database platform, et cetera, where you have these key dates to track to, you always want to be aware of this N-2 policy on the Lawson side, understanding that on the release level for your environment and your apps, et cetera, you're always going to want to be within 2 of the most current release. And so generally speaking, this isn't always going to be a major upgrade, but this is something you should be evaluating on a semi-annual basis almost of, okay, where are we at? What's the latest Lawson release? Do we need to take some of these minor patch bundles or updates to stay current? And with all of these, again, compatibility matrix is key because there are dependencies. For example, if you're on LSF 10.09 today, great, we want to go to 10.0.11. Well, if you're not on Java 8 already, that means you need to upgrade the Java runtime on your application servers to Java 8 before you can go to LSF 10.0.11. Otherwise, it's not supported. LSF 10.0.11 cannot run on Java 7. So now just to do your environment update, because you haven't maintained Java, you also have to update Java. ADFS is the same thing. You still haven't moved to ADFS. Infor has basically said, well, our newer versions of LSF require it. So if you're not on ADFS and you're still on LSF 10.09, in theory, or technically, to get to LSF 10.0.11, now you also have to implement ADFS. So all of these things kind of have dependencies, and it's really important, once you define a goal or objective of what you want to do, to go and measure that or evaluate that against the compatibility matrix to see where all these dependencies are. A lot of times, if you haven't been maintaining your system or haven't done updates in a long time, you're going to find this snowball effect of, well, we have to touch this, and all of a sudden you're now updating everything in your environment. So someone had asked a question in the chat. We are planning to move away from Lawson in 2025. Can you repeat what kind of upgrades or changes you'll need to do in Lawson up until that point? And I think this slide kind of covers that. The ultimate goal, most of this is geared towards Windows customers. If your application servers are on Windows, or you have any Windows servers in your environment, really, if you're an AIX customer today, a Linux customer today, an iSeries customer today, you're not going to have to deal with upgrading your application server in the same way that Windows customers do. But you still probably have Windows servers in your environment, maybe for Landmark, for Ming.le, and those are affected, ADFS, et cetera. So the things you should have done already, they're past due, again, be the ADFS, the LDAP-S. If you're still not on Tax Factory 11, that was a big item. A while ago, most customers should have upgraded, but that's another piece of support. And then Infor OS. All these things should have been done already based on the dates that have come and gone. Items that you can do now are upgrading and modernizing your environment platform. So LSF 10.0.11, the Portal 10.1, new user experience. All those are supported on the current operating systems, database platforms that you're on today. Landmark 11 is not version 11. It is the same runtime environment of version 11, but you can have Landmark 11 with Lawson 10. You know, if you're using Infor Process Automation today, you can have Landmark 11 Infor Process Automation with Lawson v10. So that confuses some customers, but there's a lot of benefit to moving to Landmark 11. That's something you can do today even with your v10 platform. Above and beyond that, if you're running Windows, the ultimate goal is to get, and you have 2012 R2, which is about 95+% of the customer base, you need to do something before October 2023. You cannot continue to run that operating system after that point in time without paying Microsoft for extended support. And so you're looking at then upgrading for every server that is on 2012 R2, every SQL Server database generally that's on 2016, 2014, 2012, or Oracle, prior versions, upgrading to those to the latest releases. At that point, from October 2023 onward, you should have a stable platform ultimately, should you choose to ride it out or whatever, kick the can down the road, 2023, 2024, 2025, 2026, well, then you're dealing with other things and the support for Lawson, but it should buy you that amount of time should you choose to go down that path. With all of that being said, I would say throughout all of this, you should be thinking about preparing and evaluating your move to CloudSuite, both because you're going to have to move somewhere at some point, whether it's CloudSuite or another ERP. Lawson is coming end of life, but being strategic and thinking about when you do this, because all these upgrades I talked about are large initiatives. They're costly, they're time consuming, and ultimately what you get in the end is exactly where you are today. And it's kind of like getting an oil change in your car. It doesn't really run any differently, but if you forget to do your oil change or you skip doing it, you start to notice a lot of issues. The same thing with all these underlying technology platform components. So knowing all of that, be strategic and think about what's next. When can we slot in a move or an upgrade? Understanding we have a huge amount of support work required to keep the system running past 2023, what does that mean to our organization? So what does it mean to do the server upgrades? Really, there's two main options. I guess there's a third if you want to continue to pay Microsoft to support the legacy OS. I don't recommend that for a long-term strategy because what you're going to find is that all these other vendors aren't certified for that. So even though Microsoft's certifying you and giving you patches, Infor is going to release new updates or Oracle's going to release new updates or whatever it is, and those products are only going to be supported on the newer operating systems. So it's definitely not a long-term strategy to continue to pay for extended support from Microsoft. So if we have to upgrade, there's two approaches to that. There's the side-by-side upgrades, and there's the in-place upgrades. Side-by-side, basically what that means is we're installing brand new servers, an entire brand new environment, moving all your data over, all your security over, all the environment data, application data, et cetera. The benefit of this is it allows for parallel testing in your old and new environments simultaneously. So you can test payroll processing in your quote-unquote new prod without impacting anything in current production. So it's hyper flexible, it's very clean, and it's my preferred method for upgrade. But the cons of that, obviously, is it costs more. It takes more time. We're rebuilding everything. So there's a trade-off. The other benefit would be a simple rollback strategy. If we go live and realize everything's gone wrong, well, your old server's still running. We'll just point back over to that one. We haven't even touched it, right? You can also go about doing in-place upgrades. Again, I don't really recommend these. I'm not sure, I know Infor doesn't recommend them, and I'm not sure some of your infrastructure people would even recommend them, but it is an option where that would mean is you build no new servers. And all you do is come in and upgrade the operating system on the current server. So applying a big update to it, basically, from a Microsoft perspective. The benefit to this is it's a lot faster and cheaper to deploy. The huge drawbacks to this are that there's no ability to run parallel testing. You only get one shot at upgrading your production system. Once you upgrade it, you're live. There's no testing at all. You're doing live testing in the environment after the work's done. And because of that, the rollback strategy becomes very complex, right? So let's say something goes wrong and a week's gone by. Well, what do we do? Well, you've already upgraded the server. You've already processed part of a payroll. You've done maybe a close, or I don't know what happened. You really can't go back. You're kind of stuck with it. So because of those risks, I really gravitate towards doing the side-by-side upgrade. So what does that mean? You know, I've been talking about the scope of it. Side-by-side upgrade is the recommended approach and path here. The project timeline, again, these numbers here are very high level, very average. Every customer is going to be different, but you're looking at 3 to 6 months, probably closer to 6. It's not just the build out of the environment. Because we're moving everything over, you're going to have to do a full regression testing of everything. Extensive testing is required. Parallel testing is required. That's a huge commitment from the business to be able to do all of that. Average project cost, so this would include implementation services, licensing from other vendors, infrastructure procurement. You know, generally, you're needing new servers or hosts or things like that. Estimating anywhere from 100 to 200,000 to do something like this. The project scope, what are we doing? Obviously, we're building out provisioning new infrastructure. We're doing brand new Infor installations that'll mirror what you have today for the most part. It's what we recommend, but it's all on a fresh install on a new server. And then we're going to need to migrate the data. So obviously your application data, but also your environment data, your users, your jobs, print files, work files, all that other stuff. We take it from the current server and put it into a new server so it looks exactly the same. And then the testing cycles. So how many times are you doing testing? You know, generally we recommend at least 2 testing cycles, like a unit testing or an integrated systems testing, and then a user acceptance testing. But that's kind of subjective and up to the business. But again, these are full parallel testing cycles where you're doing extensive testing in the system. So some things to consider with all of that. I mean, it's a important update that's coming. It is an actionable item for most customers. And I think it's important to consider, you know, what this impact means to our business. What is the value we're getting from it? You know, ultimately, you need to have your servers supported by Microsoft. But at the same time, in order to go through a project like this, there's almost no value delivered to the business. Your finance users and your payroll users are going to go through this entire project and really not see any benefit. Again, it's like an oil change in your car. There's no new features, there's no new enhancements. It's just now Microsoft says you're on a supported version, or Infor says, or Oracle says. So there's the compliance piece. You know, it's not just what we want to do as the Infor system administrators or the Infor application owners. You're going to start to, if you haven't already, get pushback from your infrastructure teams who manage the Windows servers. They're going to have a strategy for upgrading these. They are going to be driving some of this because ultimately they own the underlying infrastructure. That might be moving off legacy hardware, upgrading from legacy operating systems, so on and so forth. But there are going to be external forces kind of influencing this that tie into compliance. And then the licensing costs, some of the things customers don't think about, and this ties into that overall cost I was talking about. Measuring the implementation services, some of the infrastructure side of things, and then these licensing agreements. So with Micro Focus, you know, your COBOL compiler, Microsoft. So if you're not licensed for certain versions of SQL Server yet, or the enterprise version, or whatever, you're going to need to procure additional licenses or change your licensing with Microsoft. If you choose to stick with Oracle and you're not on Java 8 or licensed for Java 8 already, you know, that's additional license. So there's other things to evaluate per environment that as we move to new servers and new infrastructure, does that trigger changes to our license agreement or require that we pay any additional money for those licenses? So those are all things to think about. And the key takeaway from all of this and the focus is, I think there are actionable items to do now that impact your current environment, but encouraging customers to be strategic about this. Do we want to make this investment? What's next? Thinking about what's next, not just what you have today, because this is a large initiative. It is a large undertaking. And ultimately, it is short-term. Even if short-term to you means 4 years, 2026, what's next? What's after that? And, you know, this is a big investment. And how does that tie into our overall roadmap or strategy? And so if, you know, version 11 or CloudSuite is on that roadmap, you know, we're talking to some customers now about, well, rather than wait another couple of years to do your evaluation, can you push that now? And can you commit to a project like that now? The idea being, you know, you then don't have to spend this money to upgrade the infrastructure you have today, because you could potentially move to the CloudSuite now or in the future, near future, before that October date. You know, you don't then have to commit your end users to doing all that regression testing for the same type of environment. That time can be committed to an implementation or upgrade project. So evaluating those types of things and then looking at items you can deploy or investigate now that will give you kind of an exposure to CloudSuite. So Infor OS is a big one, or the Portal 10.1. So moving to that Soho 4.0 responsive HTML5 user experience. Sunsetting Smart Office, that product is coming at end of life. So moving to that modernized user experience that's consistent with what you'll see in CloudSuite gives your users an opportunity to see, kind of test drive some of that with your current solution before committing to a complete upgrade. Same is true with Landmark 11. I already kind of touched on that, but it can be used with Lawson version 10. You know, that's the underlying technology platform for financials and supply management, GHR or HR talent. And so that's something you can use today in your current environment, deploy for IPA with your V10 solutions. Or even if you have GHR today on premise, you know, the same is true. You can actually upgrade to Landmark 11 with GHR and run that alongside your Lawson 10 apps on-prem. Evaluating burst, you know, this is something just to look at the analytics package that are available for version 10. That is the analytics, you know, BI solution delivered with CloudSuite. You know, can you deploy that with your current solution today and get some exposure to that, some familiarity with it, which might make the move to CloudSuite easier in the future. Just becoming familiar with those new tools while you get to remain on your current system with your current data set. And doing a RICE analysis, I think, is important too. You know, a lot of times the biggest driver of timeline or impact to timeline is rewrite, when we do CloudSuite upgrades, is rewrites of interfaces, rewrites of reports, all these types of things, customization. What do we do with them? And a lot of times they come to customers and say, well, how many interfaces do you have? And what technologies are they developed in? And it's not information they have readily available at their fingertips, but it's extremely helpful to help, you know, put together a scope or an understanding of what that list might be. And so anything you can do now to start to inventory those items, identify them, you know, what can be sunset? What do we need to carry forward? I think you'll find a lot of things you may have created customizations for with Lawson aren't necessarily required in the new version. You'll find some of that. You'll also find, well, we have a demographics interface to our benefits provider or vendor. We're going to continue to have to do that. Well, what's the complexity going to be to rewrite that? What's it going to look like? And that'll help understand the scope and size of what an upgrade to CloudSuite might look like. So with that, you know, kind of leave you with any, open up to questions, you know, for any next steps, please don't hesitate to reach out. We'd be happy to schedule a meeting with one of our experts to discuss kind of custom tailored, you know, blueprint or review of all of the things I talked about. You know, what do these things mean to your organization? How do they impact your organization? And what kind of roadmap are you looking at to move forward? Ultimately, trying to help make your projects a success. If you do have questions, you know, again, reach out in the chat or unmute yourself. And if you forget or don't have anything now, but want to reach out later, my email address is on there as well. Just looking at the chat, and it says, there's a question about if moving to GHR, did you say that ADFS needs to be on version 12? No, all of the current, most current versions of the product support ADFS 3, 4, and 5. So if you're on 3, you can stay on 3. I just bring that up because every time we do it, we've done many of these ADFS migrations, and 99% of the time, had been getting pushback before the newer versions are supported from the people who manage Active Directory. And they say, well, we don't want ADFS 3, we want ADFS 4, we want ADFS 5. And at the time, that's too bad. Infor only supported ADFS 3. And so now there are these more modern versions, and I bring that up because I find that customers, outside of people who manage Infor, but people who manage the servers, people who manage Active Directory, are interested in being able to move to more modern versions of ADFS. So that's more of a decision that would be influenced by parties outside of the Infor space than, at this point, an Infor product directly forcing you to move to a newer version. Someone said, do you know when Smart Office is going away? I don't have a specific date. What I would say with that is that Smart Office, it's not in the newer version of Lawson. And so they may continue to release patches and things like that. The reality is, about things we can do now to prepare for CloudSuite. Getting rid of Smart Office is high on the list, right? Because there's no Smart Office. There's no need for Smart Office in the new version. All that type of functionality is built into the browser-based application. So starting to move your users away from Smart Office and into Infor OS and into Portal 10.1 will help modernize their user experience and prepare them for the type of user experience that would be coming with CloudSuite. For a linking to the article with end of life, I don't have it off the top of my head, but we can look for that knowledge base or notification and include it. We will be sending out a recording link or the slide deck from the presentation. And with that, I'll have Chandra also include some of those references we talked about, the KB with the Infor lifecycle, N-2, the statement of direction of support for Lawson. We'll try to include those things. Someone had asked, is corporate ADFS supported for on-prem, or do we still need to run a standalone? I would say the preference is still to have a standalone. However, the Infor OS product makes it much easier to use a corporate ADFS as compared to the Ming.le 11 solution. So when we were doing ADFS conversions for customers who are on the SharePoint-based Ming.le Foundation, 11, whatever you want to call it, the way that product's built really isn't conducive to using a corporate ADFS. And so we were telling customers, basically, you can't do it, or you really shouldn't do it. And the reason for that is there's an agent, the Infor Federation Services solution, that product gets installed on the ADFS server. So if you're using a corporate ADFS with that older version, we've now effectively turned your ADFS into an application server. We've installed IIS, all these things that are not supposed to be on an ADFS server and could impact other applications in the enterprise. And so that's the biggest reason for why we said no to corporate ADFS. With the Infor OS solution, that requirement is no longer part of it. So IFS, nothing gets installed on the ADFS server. It's more of a traditional, true natural ADFS deployment. And so it makes it possible to use a corporate ADFS. But I still, tell customers that, in my opinion, the way Infor has designed and architected a lot of this, it assumes it's going to have a standalone ADFS. And there are some implications to global settings like your web SSO lifetime. So in ADFS, there's a global lifetime setting and a cookie that gets set that enables a single sign-on between the line party trust. Usually the corporate ADFS is set up at 8 hours to time out. A lot of customers come to me and say, oh, our Lawson self-service can't be 8 hours. It has to be 30 minutes. It has to be 1 hour. Well, that right there is going to say you cannot use a corporate ADFS. Due to the nature of the way ADFS works, it's meant to have single sign-on between all those different relying parties. If that global setting is saying that single sign-on stays active for 8 hours, and the organization wants it at 8 hours to support something like Office 365 or ServiceNow or one of these other applications, but Lawson needs to be at 1 hour, well, that doesn't work. So if you have some things like timeout or other authentication settings with MFA or integrated Windows authentication that you want to differentiate from what's on the corporate standard, then that would be a good reason to use a standalone. But it is possible or easier to use a corporate ADFS with Infor OS than it was with the older version of Ming.le. Instead, we're implementing Duo in front of all of our ADFS or our trusts. You see issues with this setup? No. A lot of the customers using Duo with ADFS. The only thing I've seen issues with, I wouldn't even call this an issue, but just something to be aware of, is make sure you apply the same MFA settings to every single one of your Infor aligned party trusts. Where I've seen issues is they'll not enforce it on Ming.le and only enforce it on Lawson. And when Ming.le authenticates the user and then tries to render Lawson inside of it, it's prompting for MFA and it gets blocked. And so just keep the MFA policies consistent across all of the Infor aligned party trusts, and you should be okay. Lots of customers are using Duo or other MFA provider solutions with their ADFS. That's a good thing to bring up just with MFA. Kind of a random topic would be Azure MFA. A lot of customers are concerned about, we like MFA, we want MFA, but we don't have it today. We don't want to pay, Duo is expensive. We don't want to pay for Duo licenses for all of our self-service users. And they have Azure. So Azure MFA is very nicely integrated with the newer versions of ADFS, starting with ADFS 4 or Server 2016. And so if you can get up to that version, then you can leverage Azure MFA much easier and natively than if you want out to a third party for that type of solution. Just to double check, Lawson is only going to be supported until April 2026. I mean, I'm paraphrasing the document, but yes, they have said we're committed to supporting the product up until April 2026. And then at that point, or within that period from now until then, you know, we are also able to change this subject to like 2 years advance notice. So that's kind of, I don't think they're going to push it up anymore, but you may find that in 2024, they give you customers a couple more years. I don't know, but they're basically saying, yes, that date is April 2026. And so regardless, maybe they give you another year, maybe they give you another 2 years. It doesn't really matter. I mean, we need to start thinking about what's next because the end of life is coming. And the reality is Lawson's a pretty old ERP. Version 10's been out for over 10 years, and that's ancient. It's not from a technology perspective. And what we're seeing with a lot of our customers is you're so used to just maintaining Lawson as is. We only take patches if we have to. And even the patches we take, we don't really get anything except fixes or year-end bundles or something like that. There's no new enhancements. The product's very static. And it's old. I mean, it's not modern compared to some of the other ERP solutions. And as you evaluate or look to CloudSuite or version 11, it's just such a different way of interacting with the product because obviously they're fixing things and patching things, but there's a whole ton of effort and investment going into enhancing the product. So it's just so refreshing or different or new to think about, wow, they actually put the feature in that is really valuable. And I'm getting that, you know, not doing anything. It's just deploying the product and it's not just a fix. It's something that's going to improve our business, our day-to-day operations. So it's, you know, modernized with COVID-19. You know, that's a big thing that a lot of organizations aren't used to tracking, vaccine tracking. Well, there's features and enhancements that are coming into the new products, but aren't really going to be delivered to Lawson because that's more in a maintenance mode. And so for all those things, I mean, I would be looking at moving strategically rather than just trying to really drag it out until the end of that time if I were a customer. That's it for the chat. Kendra, did you see any other questions or is anyone on the phone line that had a question?
I haven't seen any others come through. I think this is everything. If we've missed one, though, please feel free to unmute yourself or enter it into the chat again for us.
Well, thank you everyone for your time. We'll be sending out a link to the recording and the materials for everyone who registered. And then we'll also try to include a couple of those reference documents that you all had asked for in the chat. Have a good one.